The number was already on the display. When Delegate Sora walked into the hall, she did not notice it at first. She was busy straightening her robe, adjusting the translation bead behind her left mandible, nodding to the Kth envoy. Across the chamber, the Galactic Concordat's Grand Assembly Hall on Vorth Prime was designed to impress. 600 seats, arranged in sweeping tiers around a central floor, light panels that shifted color by species to reduce visual strain, a ceiling high enough to accommodate the Durath who stood nearly 4 m tall and had a known discomfort with low spaces. It was the most sophisticated diplomatic chamber in known space, and on most days the business conducted inside it carried the weight of civilizations. Today someone had put a number on the central display. That made 2 Velthari delegates click their mandibles in a sound that translated roughly as suppressed amusement. The number was 47,308,009. Below it, in the clean font of the Concordat standard data feed, secondary line read, confirmed volunteer. Submission, human species response. Windows 72 hours. Delegate Sora read it twice, then she looked at her assistant, a young Velthari named Preth, who was already pulling up the full breakdown on a secondary screen. Preth's mandibles were doing something they rarely did in a formal session. They were twitching. Age distribution, Sora said quietly. Preth handed her the tablet. Sora read it. Then she did something she would later deeply regret. She laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has just seen something so unexpected that the body produces amusement as a reflex before the brain can apply judgment. But it carried. The translation systems picked it up and rendered it in 63 languages simultaneously, and within 30 seconds. Half the chamber was doing the same thing. The average age of the human volunteers was 68.4 years. The youngest confirmed submission was 62. The oldest was 89, a retired shipyard worker from the coast of Maine named Harold Finch, who had listed his current occupation as mostly fishing and his relevant experience as 41 years welding pressure hulls, 2 tour in the Navy, and a general unwillingness to sit still. He had attached a photograph. He was smiling in it. The Concordat had sent in an emergency call across all member species 3 weeks earlier. The Dominion, a coalition of non-member civilizations operating beyond the galactic rim, had begun pushing hard against the border. Concordat colonies were being blockaded. Supply lines were cut. The call asked for volunteer soldiers to supplement the standing fleets. Every species had responded with young fighters in peak physical condition. The Keth had sent 20,000 warriors under the age of 30. Lern had sent 9,000 trained field medics, none over 40. The Velthari themselves had contributed a full division of their ground assault corps. Average age 26. Humanity had sent its grandparents, 47 million of them. The medical files were the part that really got the chamber going. One volunteer, retired coal miner from Western Pennsylvania named Lou Garrett, was 74 years old and had a prosthetic left arm. The arm was listed as a non-disqualifying modification. Lou had noted in the comments field that the prosthetic was actually stronger than the original, and he considered it an upgrade. Another submission belonged to Walt Prout, 71, a retired Navy corpsman, who had listed his relevant experience across 4 different lines because one line was not enough. Walt had attached a personal note that read, "I have done this before. I am not afraid to do it again." There was Carol Vance, 68, a retired Army logistics officer who had managed supply chains through a Category 4 hurricane relief effort and had once kept a forward battalion fed and equipped for 6 days using nothing but improvised transport and what she described as creative problem solving. Her application had no personal note, just a clean list of qualifications, formatted precisely with every date, confirmed in every reference, cross-linked. The Concordat intake system had flagged her file as unusually complete. It was the kind of application that looked like it had been filled out by someone who understood that the details were what kept people alive. Gene Ockafer was 66. He had spent 22 years as a homicide detective in one of Earth's larger cities and had retired 2 years earlier after losing his wife to a long illness. His application was the shortest of any human submission. Name, age, relevant experience, 1 line. Know how to read people and situations. Under pressure, I have been doing it my whole career. No personal note, no photograph, just the facts offered. Without decoration. Donna Hale was 63 and had spent 30 years as a wildfire crew chief in the forests of the American Northwest. She had managed evacuations, terrain navigation, and emergency coordination in conditions that had killed less experienced people. She had also, according to her file, written a training manual for new crew members that was still in use by 3 different regional agencies. Her application note said, "I am healthy, experienced, and available immediately." The chamber laughed at all of them. The laughter went on for nearly 2 full minutes, which in diplomatic terms was an eternity. The Keth commander in the military advisor section, a broad-shouldered reptilian officer named Vrack, who had fought in 6 engagements and never once been surprised on a battlefield, shook his head slowly. He said something to his aide that the translation system rendered as, "It is a gesture of solidarity. They are showing support without the capacity to contribute. We should accept it." Gracefully, his aide agreed. Nobody on the floor of the chamber was yet thinking about what 47 million people who had already survived the worst of their lives might look like once they decided to spend what was left. The only person in the room who was not laughing was a young human diplomat named Myra Sultan, 34 years old, who served as the Concordat's human liaison officer. She was sitting in the secondary delegate section, 1 tier above the main floor, and she was watching the chamber with an expression that was very still and very calm. She had seen the submissions before they went public. She had read the files. She knew who these people were. She had grown up with people exactly like them in a small town in the Midwest, where the men and women who built things and fixed things and kept the lights on were never the youngest people in the room. When the laughter finally died down, the session chair called for comments. Delegate Sora rose and offered the Velthari position. The human gesture was acknowledged with appreciation, but perhaps a medical review process should be implemented before any human volunteers were formally inducted, given the biological realities of the age group involved. Several other delegates nodded. The Caith observer section murmured agreement. It was politely done. It was also deeply wrong in a way that nobody in the Chamber had the experience to recognize. Yet, Myra Solton pressed the request button on her console. The chair recognized her. She stood straightened her jacket and walked to the center dais. The chamber was quiet. She looked out at 63 species, most of them still faintly amused, and she said 7 words. These are not our last resort. She paused for exactly one breath. They are our first choice. The chamber was silent. There is a difference, she said. And in approximately 6 weeks, I expect you will understand what that difference is. She returned to her seat. Nobody laughed after that, not because they believed her, not yet, but because something in the steadiness of her voice made the laughter feel for the first time slightly premature. Outside the hall, the first transport carrying Lou Garrett, Walt Prout, Carol Vance, Gino Akefer, Donna Hale, and approximately 3,000 other human retirees was already en route to Farath Station, a deep space logistics hub 4 light-years from the Dominion border. They had been traveling for 11 days. Most of them had used the time to sleep, read play cards, and in Lou's case, learn 3 words of Keth from a language primer he had downloaded. Before departure, the galaxy had decided they were a joke. They had not been consulted on that decision. They were about to offer a rebuttal. Farath Station smelled like recycled air and machine oil and something faintly chemical that nobody had ever been able to fully filter out of the ventilation system. It was a working station, not a comfortable one. The corridors were wide enough for cargo loaders. The ceilings were low, and the lighting ran in long strips of cold white that made everyone look slightly unwell. The Concordat officers who had been assigned to receive the human volunteers had been briefed to expect a difficult intake process. They had been told to be patient. They had been told to plan for slower movement, more medical interventions, and a generally reduced operational tempo. What they got instead started within the first 40 minutes of the transport. Docking. The intake bay was a large open space designed to process incoming personnel in organized waves. There were stations for identification, medical screening, equipment assignment, and unit placement. The Concordat had assigned 4 officers to manage the flow, supported by a logistics team that had set up the intake manifests the previous day. The manifests were the standard format, which meant they were sorted by species and biological classification, not by skill set or experience. For most incoming groups, this worked fine. For a group composed almost entirely of people who had spent their lives managing complex systems under pressure, it created an immediate and obvious inefficiency. Lou Garrett spotted it in about 8 minutes. He was standing in the identification line, holding his transit card, watching the intake process with a calm, assessing look of a man who had spent 4 decades running a mine crew and knew exactly what a poorly organized workflow looked like. The problem was simple. The medical screening station was positioned after the equipment assignment station, which meant people were receiving gear before anyone had confirmed what they were physically cleared to carry. This was creating a bottleneck at both stations, as records had to be walked back and cross-checked manually. Lou stepped out of the line. Young Concordat logistics officer, Lurin named Tessic, who would later become very important to this story, moved to redirect him. Lou held up his prosthetic hand in a gesture of polite Pause, pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket and sketched revised flow diagram in about 90 seconds. Then he handed it to Tessic. Said, "This will get you through about 40% faster," and stepped back into the identification line. Tessic stared at the notebook. The diagram was correct. Not approximately correct, precisely correct down to the staff positioning. That would eliminate the cross-traffic. At the bottleneck point, Tessic called over the senior logistics officer, Keth named Grath, who was not yet a significant figure but was watching from the edge of the bay with a skeptical expression he had been wearing since the transport docked. Grath looked at the diagram. He looked at Lou, who was now back in line and apparently reading a small paperback book he had produced from somewhere. Grath looked at the diagram again. He reorganized the intake bay according to Lou's sketch. The processing time dropped by 38%. Nobody from the original planning team said anything about this. There was not really anything to say. The medical screening went differently than Tessic had expected. He was the chief medical officer on the station's intake rotation, a Lurin with 14 years of field experience and a genuine professional commitment to doing his job well. He had reviewed the human medical files before the transport arrived and had prepared a detailed triage plan. Based on what he had read, the plan involved rerouting a significant portion of the volunteers to reduce duty classifications. Many of the files showed the accumulated physical record of long and physically demanding lives. Replaced joints, old fractures healed improperly, chronic conditions managed with medication. Tessic had prepared briefing packets for the human liaison officer about the expected reclassifications. He was being responsible. He was being thorough. Walt Prout was his first patient. Walt sat down in the screening chair, gave his name and identification number without being asked, and waited with the patience of a man who had sat in a great many waiting rooms over and had made peace with the fact. Tessic ran the standard biological scan, reviewed the readout, and began explaining his reclassification recommendation in the carefully measured tone of a professional delivering difficult news. Gently, Walt let him finish. Then he said, "Can I ask you something first?" Tessic said yes. Walt pointed to the triage board on the wall behind Tessic, where the current patient queue was displayed. He identified 3 specific patients by number and explained that 2 of them were showing early indicators of a pressure-related circulatory condition common in species that had recently traveled through the specific type of jump point on the route from Earth to Farath. He said the 3rd patient, listed as low priority, was actually showing a pattern in their readout that suggested a developing respiratory issue that would become serious within 48 hours if not addressed. He said this quietly, without drama, in the tone of someone sharing a professional observation. Tessic checked the readouts for all 3 patients. Walt was right on all 3 counts. 3rd patient, reclassified to high priority, was put on a treatment protocol within the hour. Tessic later confirmed that without intervention, the respiratory situation would have become critical within 2 days. Tessic did not deliver the reclassification briefing to the human liaison officer. He tore up the packets. Walt was assigned as senior trauma coordinator for the station's medical bay within 4 hours of his arrival. When the Concordat Medical Command sent a query asking why a 71-year-old human volunteer had been placed in a senior coordinating role, Tessick replied with a 3-paragraph explanation that ended with the sentence, "His practical diagnostic accuracy in the first 2 hours of his arrival exceeded that of any intake officer I have worked with in 14 years. The query was not followed up. Carol Vance had a different kind of first day. She arrived at the supply management section, introduced herself to the officer in charge, a quiet Vilthari named Oren, who had been running Farrat's logistics for 2 years, and asked if she could review the current supply chain status. Oren, who had been told the human volunteers were here in a support capacity and should be given simple tasks, handed her the overview report. Carol read it in 11 minutes, which was fast. Then she asked for the detailed sub-reports. Oren provided them. Carol read those in 40 minutes and then sat quietly for a while, making notes in the margin of a printed copy she had asked for because, as she explained, she thought better on paper. When she was done, she had identified a supply routing inefficiency that had been costing the station an estimated 15% of its daily resupply capacity. The problem had existed for 8 months. 3 previous reviews had missed it, because it was created by the interaction of 2 separate scheduling systems that had never been evaluated together. Carol had spotted it because she had once managed the interaction of 4 separate supply systems during a disaster relief operation and had learned that the failure point was almost always in the space between systems, not inside any one of them. She did not announce this as a discovery. She wrote it up in a clear 1-page summary with a proposed correction and placed it on Oren's desk with a note that said, "This might help, let me know if you have questions." Oren implemented the correction the next day. The resupply capacity improvement was real and immediate. Oren sent a short message to the station commander that afternoon. It said the human logistics officer should be given full access to the supply chain data and a support team. I say this without any reservation. Jean Akefer did not produce anything that could be measured in a report. What he did was harder to quantify. He spent his first 3 days on the station walking. He walked the corridors. During all 3 shift changes, he ate in the common areas and watched the personnel there. He sat in the communication rooms for a few hours each afternoon and listened to the ambient chatter of a busy station at work. He said very little to anyone. He was not unfriendly. He was simply observant, the particular way of someone who has spent 2 decades in a job that required him to notice what other people missed. On the 4th day, he went to Carol Vance and told her that one of the Concordat supply officers in the northern loading bay was not who he said he was. He could not prove it yet. He said that directly. What he could say was that the officer in question walked differently depending on who was watching, used his right hand when he thought he was unobserved, but his left hand when he knew he was being seen, and had twice responded to questions about his home station with answers that were slightly different in each telling. Small things, the kind of things that did not appear in any file and would not trigger any automated system. Carol took it to the station security coordinator, a Keth officer who initially dismissed it as exactly the kind of vague concern that wasted investigative time. Carol was patient and firm. she said she was. Not asking for an arrest, she was asking for a quiet background check. The Keth officer ran it. The results came back in 18 hours. The supply officer's identity documents had been altered. He was later identified as a Dominion intelligence operative who had been in place for 4 months gathering resupply route information. The station commander called Gene in after the operative was detained. He asked Gene how he had known. Gene said, "I didn't know. I noticed. Those are different things." The commander wrote in his report that the human volunteer had demonstrated an observational and analytical capacity that significantly exceeded expectation. Gene read the report when a copy was forwarded to the Human Liaison Office. He did not comment on it. He returned to his afternoon routine of walking the corridors and watching the station work. Donna Hale had been given, as her initial assignment, a spot in the basic terrain navigation refresher course that all incoming volunteers attended. It was designed for soldiers new to off-world environments and covered basic survival principles, reading alien topography, and responding to environmental hazards. The instructor was a Keth officer with solid credentials. The course was competent. It was also within about 40 minutes of Donna sitting in the back row, very clearly not covering the things that actually kept people alive. When an environment turned hostile, she did not interrupt. She took notes. After the session, she asked the instructor if she could speak with him privately. She spent 20 minutes explaining 3 specific scenarios in which the course's recommended procedures would produce predictable failures based on terrain dynamics she had learned managing wildfires in complex mountain geography. She had examples. She had the reasoning behind each one. She was not condescending. She was precise. The instructor was quiet for a while after she finished. Then he asked her if she would be willing to run a supplemental session for the incoming units. She said yes. Then he asked if she had any written materials. She said she had notes. He said he would arrange for them to be formatted. She said she would need to add a section on reading alien terrain specifically, and she would need some time with the station's geological data for the engagement zones. He provided it. The supplemental session ran 2 weeks later. 43 soldiers from 5 different species attended. At the end, one of the Keth soldiers, young and not yet senior enough to have strong opinions about anything, came up to Donna and said that 3 of the techniques she had covered were things he had never seen in any Concordat training program. He asked where they had come from. She said 30 years of watching what went wrong and making sure it didn't go wrong again. He wrote them down. The Concordat command staff held their first formal review of the human volunteer integrate at the end of the 3rd week. The session was led by a senior Valthari strategist named Vorth, who had a reputation for blunt assessments and no patience for reports that buried the important thing in the middle. The officers who presented at the review had expected to spend most of the session discussing the challenges of integrating older volunteers into an active military station. Instead, what the reports described was something considerably different. Vorth listened to all of it without interrupting. When the last officer finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What I am hearing is that they arrived here having already done the hard version of everything we are doing. Is that a fair summary?" nobody disagreed. Vorth wrote her assessment that evening. It was 3 paragraphs. The last paragraph read, "These volunteers are not what the assembly anticipated. They are not symbolic. They are not a liability. They are individuals who have operated under sustained pressure for decades and have developed a form of practical competence that our standard evaluation frameworks are not designed to capture. They do not panic. In my observation, the ability to not panic is worth more in operational terms than almost any other measurable quality. I recommend full integration." Recommendation was filed. It was approved without debate in the medical bay that same evening. Walt Prout was finishing a 12-hour shift. Tessick was at the adjacent station entering the day's patient records. They had worked together for 3 weeks now, and they had developed the quiet efficiency of 2 professionals who have learned to anticipate each other. Tessick looked up from his screen and said, "Can I ask you something?" Walt said yes. "Why did you come here?" Tessick asked. "You did not have to. You could have stayed where you were." Walt thought about this for a moment. He had thought about it before. He had thought about it the morning he signed the application, sitting at his kitchen table in the early light with the form on the screen and a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He had thought about the answer for a while, and then he had just hit submit because thinking about it further was not going to produce better answer than the one he already had. "Because I know how to do something that helps people stay alive," Walt said, "and there are people out there who need that. The math is simple." Tessick nodded slowly. He entered the last patient record and closed his screen. "Your species is unusual," he said. Walt picked up his jacket and smiled just slightly. "We get that a lot," he said. The battle plan for the relief of Cherville had been drawn up by Concordat High Command over the course of 11 days and involved 3 Keth assault companies, 2 Lurin support units, and a rear area logistics and medical corps that included most of the human retiree volunteers from Ferret Station. The plan was solid. The orbital bombardment timing was well coordinated. The landing zones had been selected using current intelligence. The command structure was clear. The plan began to fail 4 minutes after the first drop. Ships entered the atmosphere. The Dominion had deployed a sensor disruption field over the primary landing zone. It was not a new technology. It was an older system, one the Concordat had faced before, but the specific configuration used over Cherville was designed to target the frequency range that the Keth assault units relied on for their real-time coordination. When the field activated, the 3 Keth companies lost contact with each other and with the orbital command ships simultaneously. 2 of the companies were mid-descent. The third had already landed in what turned out to be not the primary landing zone, but a position 2 km off target in terrain that gave the Dominion ground forces a significant elevation advantage. The rear command post, positioned on a plateau 8 km from the forward landing zone, was not in the disruption field's primary coverage. Its communication systems were functioning. What it was not by design was a combat command node. It had been set up to manage supply, routing, medical coordination, and communication relay for the support units. The officer nominally in charge was a young Keth lieutenant named Davin, who had strong organizational instincts, and had never been in a position where the plan was no longer the plan. Davin had been in his seat for approximately 90 seconds after the disruption field activated when Carol Vance walked up beside him and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "I need you to keep your voice calm and tell me what your communication channels are still showing," she said. Davin told her. Carol listened. She did not sit down. She behind Anne's station with her arms crossed and her eyes moving across the 3 screens in front of her, and she began to think in the particular way she had learned over 30 years of managing situations where the original plan had stopped being relevant. The Keth First company was down and off target. Their last known position was in a narrow ravine, and the Dominion elevation advantage meant any attempt to move from that position without support would produce losses. The second company was still in descent, communications unreliable, trajectory still recoverable if redirected in the next 6 minutes. The third company was at the correct landing zone but had no communication with the other 2 and did not know the first company was in trouble. Carol needed to redirect the second company, get a communication relay to the third company with updated information, reroute the medical unit to a position that could serve all 3 landing areas instead of just the primary, and do all of this using a command post that had not been designed to do any of it. She did all of it in 11 minutes. She used the rear post communication system, which ran on an older band that the disruption field was not calibrated to suppress. She used Davin's staff to run physical relays to positions that extended the communication range. She used the supply routing software, which she knew better than anyone else on the station, to calculate new drop coordinates for the second company's revised landing approach. She did not shout. She did not panic. She gave instructions in the clear, direct tone of a woman who once coordinated food and medicine for a battalion of people trapped by floodwater and had learned that a calm voice was the first thing you gave people who were scared. The second company landed on revised coordinates in a position from which they could move toward the first company's ravine with the elevation advantage instead of against it. The third company received updated information through the relay and held their position, creating a stable anchor point for the assault. The medical unit repositioned to a central location that Donna Hale, who had been analyzing the terrain data for a different reason and was standing at the back of the command post, pointed out, could serve all 3 landing areas with approximately equal response time. Carol looked at Donna's suggestion, looked at the map and said yes, in the tone of someone who has been shown the right answer and recognizes it immediately. Lou Garrett was not supposed to be at the forward position. He had been assigned to a supply delivery team moving between the rear post and the forward staging area, a role that kept him several kilometers back from the actual landing zones. He was driving the third vehicle in a 4-vehicle supply convoy when a burst of static on the comm channel was followed by a fragmented transmission that included a set of coordinates and a word that every military person of any species recognized in any language, because it had been part of human radio protocol for over a century. Pinned. The convoy was not a combat unit. The convoy had no weapons beyond personal sidearms. Lou had a prosthetic arm and a toolkit, and the accumulated knowledge of 4 decades working in spaces where panic was a luxury nobody could afford. He pulled the vehicle off the main track. The other drivers asked what he was doing. Lou said he was going to check something and they should stay with the vehicles. Then he took a handheld terrain reader, a first aid kit, and a flare launcher from the emergency kit in the back of his vehicle, and he went on foot toward the coordinates in the transmission. What he found was a crater, approximately 20 m across, where a HFY team of 9 soldiers had taken cover after their dropship took a hit on landing. They were not wounded, but they were in a position where any movement above the crater's lip drew fire from a Dominion unit on the ridge above them. The HFY team leader, a young soldier named Prahl, who had the controlled breathing of someone managing fear with considerable effort, looked up at the human who had just appeared at the crater's edge and said in translation, "Who are you?" Lou said. "The man with the flare gun." "Have you ever been in a mine?" Prahl had not been in a mine. Lou spent 3 minutes explaining the principle of misdirection, using sound and light in an enclosed space adapted for a ravine environment. He pointed out that the ridgeline above them had a narrow section, approximately 60 m to the north, where the angle of the slope created a shadow corridor that the Dominion position could not see into directly. He said he was going to fire 2 flares, one to the south and one to the east, and that in the 40 seconds of disruption that followed, the fire team needed to move along the crater's northern edge and into the shadow corridor. He said he had used a version of this technique to extract 3 workers from a collapsed shaft during a flooding event in 2031, and that the principle was the same. Prahl looked at him for 1 second, then he looked at his team, then he said the flares went up. All 9 HFY soldiers reached the shadow corridor. They were out of the Dominion's field of fire within the 40-second window. Lou was the last one over the crater edge. He moved, for a man of 74 with a prosthetic arm, with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent his entire adult life making decisions about how to move through tight spaces without getting anyone hurt. They reached the forward staging area 20 minutes later. Prout reported into his company commander. The commander looked at Lou and asked who had coordinated the extraction. Prout said the human. Commander looked at Lou again, longer, this time with an expression that was not quite what it had been before. In the medical bay that had been set up at the central position Donna had identified, Walt Prout had been running for 6 hours. The mass casualty event had come in 2 waves, which was the harder kind because the first wave depleted your resources and the second wave found you already stretched. Walt had seen this pattern before during a hurricane response on the Gulf Coast, where the boats had come in faster than the helicopters, and the triage had to keep moving before the first wave was finished. He did not have everything he needed. He had considerably less than everything he needed. What he had was a trained team, a clear priority system, and 40 years of knowing which decisions produced the best outcomes when the options were all imperfect. Tessick worked beside him the entire time. They did not talk much. They did not need to. They had developed, over the weeks of working together on Ferret Station, the kind of professional synchrony that is built by doing difficult work alongside someone whose judgment you have learned to trust. When Walt made a call, Tessic moved on it. When Tessic flagged something, Walt was already looking at it. The other medics on the team, a mix of species and experience levels, organized themselves around the two of them without being told to, because competence under pressure creates its own gravity. When the second wave ended and the immediate critical cases were stabilized, Tessic sat down on a supply crate and looked at the patient board. Every patient on it was alive, every one of them, in a mass casualty event of the scale with these resources. That outcome was not statistically expected. Tessic looked at Walt, who was washing his hands at the sterilization station and already looking at the board to see what needed to follow up attention. Tessic said, "How?" Walt said, "You prioritize the ones you can save, and you do not spend time on the ones you can't, and you keep moving forward. It is hard the first 100 times. After that, it becomes something you can do. The first 100 times," Tessic repeated. "I have been doing this for 40 years, Walt said. "It adds up." The battle for Charival ended with the Concordat position held. The Dominion had anticipated the assault and had prepared the disruption field with the specific intention of breaking the Keth coordination and routing the assault companies. The plan had worked exactly as designed, except for the fact that the rear command post had not broken. The Keth companies had been saved not by a counter-maneuver from high command, but by a 68-year-old logistics officer who had reorganized a crisis from a support post using a communication band. Too old to jam in knowledge, too practical to teach in a classroom. In his after-action report, Keth Commander Vrak wrote the citation for the human logistics unit himself. The Keth did not typically write their own citations. They had staff for that. But Vrak sat down the evening after Charival and wrote the citation in his own words, and when it was submitted to the Concordat record, it was filed exactly as he had written it. The relevant passage read, "In my career I have served alongside soldiers of 8 species. I have evaluated combat effectiveness by every measure available to military science. After the engagement at Charival, I am compelled to add a measure that does not appear in our standard frameworks: capacity to remain functional when everything has stopped working as intended. The human auxiliary personnel demonstrated this capacity at a level I have not previously observed. I recommend their designation be elevated." Without delay, the citation was filed. High Command read it. They upgraded the human unit's designation from auxiliary support to primary combat support the following week. Among the Keth soldiers who had been extracted from the ravine, word spread quickly about the human with the flare gun and the mine analogy. Prowl told his company told the others. The story was retold, simplified and slightly exaggerated, with each telling as stories always are. But the core of it stayed accurate. The old human with the metal arm had walked out to the front alone, with no weapon that mattered, and had fought his way through a problem that 9 trained soldiers had not been able to solve. Graf, the young Keth liaison officer from Ferret Station who had been quietly watching Lou for weeks, heard the story in the common area of the rear post the evening after the battle. He did not say anything. He sat with his meal and listened to Prowl tell it, and then he sat for a while after Prowl moved on. Then he went to find Lou, who was in the supply section, performing inventory with a clipboard. and the patient attention of a man who had done inventory 10,000 times and still did it right every single time. Graf stood beside Lou for a moment. Without saying anything, Lou kept counting, then Graf said in the Keth, "Trichin, there is a word for an elder soldier who carries others to safety when it is not his duty to do so. It does not translate well into standard Concordat language, but I want you to know I am using it for you." Lou looked up from his clipboard. He looked at Graf for a moment, then he nodded once in the quiet way of someone who has received a gift and knows the right response is not to diminish it with too many words. "Thank you, Lou," said. He went back to his inventory. News from Charival moved through Concordat space the way important news always moved, fast and changed a little by every telling, but holding its essential truth intact. The core of the story was this: the Concordat had come close to losing Charival, and the thing that had prevented it was not a superior weapon or a tactical genius in the command chair. It was the steadiness of a group of older humans in a support post who had responded to catastrophic failure of the plan by treating it as a problem to be solved rather than a crisis to be survived. The reaction was not simple. In the Concordat assembly, Delegate Sora of the Valthari asked for a recess on the day the formal after-action report was distributed. She was seen in a corridor outside the chamber in conversation with the Lurin chief medical officer for approximately 20 minutes. Nobody recorded what was said. When the session resumed, Sora rose at the first opportunity and made a statement. She did not use the word apology because the Valthari did not have a cultural tradition that framed apologies the way humans did. What she did was move, formally and by name, to reclassify the human retiree volunteer force from their current designation to the primary combat support level that Vrock had recommended. She delivered the motion in the flat, even tone of a professional doing her job. She did not mention the laughter from 3 weeks earlier. She did not need to. The motion passed. Myra Sultan, sitting in the secondary delegate section, watched the vote with the same still expression she had worn the day the laughter had gone through the chamber. She wrote nothing in her notes. She simply watched the numbers on the vote display until they reached the threshold, and then she looked down at her hands for a moment, and then she looked back up. On Earth, the news from Charival moved through the population with a quality that was hard to name. It was not quite pride, though. It was close to that. It was more like the feeling of something confirmed. Many of the people who had submitted the original 47 million applications had done so while their families argued with them, worried about them, tried to talk them out of it. The families had not been wrong to worry, but they had perhaps been wrong about what their parents and grandparents and retired neighbors were still capable of. The second wave of applications arrived without a formal announcement. There was no new call. There was no government campaign. People simply started submitting, and within 10 days the number had climbed by 4 million. They were not all veterans. Clarence Webb was a retired cardiothoracic surgeon from Atlanta, 72 years old, who submitted his application with a cover note that listed his surgical hours, his current physical fitness assessment, and one line that said, "I still have steady hands. I checked this morning." Ruth Garza was a retired school principal from New Mexico, 69, who had managed a building of 700 children, through everything from minor emergencies to a significant earthquake, and who wrote in her application, "I have spent 30 years solving problems before they became crises. I believe this is a transferable skill." High Command on Ferret Station received the second wave list and forwarded it to Carol Vance, who had by this point become the de facto coordinator of human volunteer integration. She read through the new submissions with the focused attention she gave to every document that required a decision, and then she organized them into functional categories with the efficiency of someone who has long since learned that the first step in managing any large group of people is knowing what each of them is actually good at. Clarence Webb was assigned to the surgical team. His first day in the operating bay, the Lurin surgeon he was working alongside tried to brief him on the station's surgical protocols. Clarence listened politely and then asked 3 questions that identified 2 areas where the protocols were producing longer than necessary recovery times for a specific type of injury common in Concord at soldiers. The Lurin surgeon checked the data. Clarence was right on both counts. The protocols were revised. The recovery time improvement was documented. Clarence went back to work. Ruth Garza was assigned to the unit coordination office, a role that involved managing the administrative flow between 15 different subunits with incompatible filing systems, communication habits, and cultural expectations about how requests were supposed to be phrased. She had it organized within a week. When asked how, she said, "Middle school, it is essentially the same problem. The relationship between the human volunteers and the Caith soldiers had been shifting since Charival, and the shift was most visible in the small things. Caith soldiers who had previously walked through the common areas without acknowledging the human units began stopping to talk, not always in language because the translation systems were imperfect and sometimes produced genuinely confusing results, but in the gestural language of people who share a workplace and are beginning to understand each other's rhythms. Prall's fire team, the 9 soldiers Lou had extracted from the crater, made a habit of eating their evening meal in the section of the common area closest to the human volunteers. Nobody formalized this. It was simply where they went. Grath had been changed by Charival in a way that he would not have been able to articulate precisely, but that was visible in how he moved through the station. He had requested through the standard channels to be reassigned from his general liaison role to a specific position embedded with the human auxiliary unit. The request had been reviewed by his commanding officer, who had noted in the approval that Grath had shown unusual initiative in making it. Grath had not thought of it as unusual. He had simply thought of it as the obvious next step. He spent a significant amount of time with Lou, who had accepted Grath's presence with the same undemonstrative ease with which he accepted most things. They did not talk about the extraction in the ravine. They talked about other things. Lou explained how a longwall mining system worked, using a napkin drawing because Grath had asked what a mine was, and Lou found that if he started explaining things from the beginning, people generally understood them better than if he started in the middle. Grath told Lou about the Caith tradition of elder soldiers who were called by word, that the translation system rendered as Weight bearers meaning those whose experience was heavy enough to carry others across difficult ground. Lou thought about this for a while, then he said, "We don't have a word for that. We probably should." The Dominion, meanwhile, had been doing its own assessment. The Dominion's intelligence division was composed of analysts with no particular interest in being wrong twice about the same thing. The report on the human volunteer anomaly was filed 3 weeks after Charavel and ran to 40 pages, which was long for a single subject intelligence assessment. The analysts had pulled everything available: the intake records from Ferret Station, the action reports from Charavel, the communication intercepts from the command post during the battle, the medical records that had been declassified for interagency sharing, and the second-hand accounts from the detained Dominion operative who had been identified and removed from Ferret Station by Gene Ockeffer's observation. The report's central finding was framed carefully because the analysts understood that their leadership found unexpected conclusions inconvenient. The finding was this: the human volunteer force posed a tactical risk not because of physical capability, which was assessed as below standard by all conventional measures, but because of what the report called post-threshold psychology. This was the analyst term for the mental state of individuals who had already experienced the worst anticipated outcomes of their lives and emerged from those experiences still functioning. The report argued that such individuals operated without the fear-based hesitation that governed the decision-making of younger, less experienced soldiers. This hesitation, the report noted, was the primary target of the Dominion's standard disruption tactics, which were designed to create enough uncertainty and fear to collapse an opponent's coordination against soldiers who were no longer afraid. In the ways those tactics assumed, the disruption approach was substantially less effective. The report recommended that Dominion field commanders avoid direct engagement with human retiree units wherever possible. The recommendation was forwarded to the relevant command sections. It was not acted on. The field commanders who received it had built their careers on a specific understanding of how battles were won, and a 40-page report from analysts who had never commanded a field unit was not going to revise their into ascensions about what constituted a real threat. They would have an opportunity to update that view. Carol Vance was offered a promotion 3 weeks after Charavel. The offer came directly from Concordat High Command and included a staff position at the strategic planning level, which was not a post that had ever been offered to a human before. It was a significant elevation. The communication that conveyed the offer also, somewhat presumptuously, included a draft reassignment order that would separate her from the unit she had been coordinating. Carol sent back an acceptance with one modification: she would take the position. Her unit stayed together. She did not explain her reasoning. She did not need to. High Command reviewed the modification for approximately 4 hours and then accepted it, noting in the internal record that the human logistics officer's operational judgment has been consistently superior to expectation, and there is no administrative reason sufficient to override it. Oren, the Valthyri logistics officer from Ferath, who had implemented Carol's supply chain fix on the first week, heard about the promotion through the Station's informal communication. Network, he sent Carol a short message. It said, "Congratulations, I hope give you the resources you need. If they don't, I expect you will find them." Anyway, Carol sent back 2 words. Correct, thanks, Donna Hales Field. Adaptation manual had taken on a life of its own. What had started as handwritten notes shared with a single training officer had been formatted, expanded, translated into 11 languages, and was being used in 4 different Concordat training programs by the time the second wave of human volunteers arrived. When Concordat Training Command asked her to produce a formal second edition, she agreed on the condition that she be given access to the terrain data from the Vel Areth system, which was where she understood the next major engagement was likely to occur. Training Command agreed. She spent 2 weeks with the geological and atmospheric data, added a 12-page section on the specific environmental challenges of that system, and submitted the revised manual on a Tuesday afternoon with the same practical directness she brought to everything. The manual's epigraph had been added by her on the last revision. It read, "The land is not your enemy. Inattention is." Gene Achefer, who was not a man who attracted attention or sought to keep it, had become a person of some informal significance on the station in the weeks after he had identified the Dominion operative. He had not done anything to cause this. He had simply continued doing what he had always done, which was walking the corridors, watching the common areas, sitting in the communication rooms in the afternoon, and listening to the ambient life of a station under pressure. But people had started noticing that Gene noticed things. A Keth security officer had begun stopping him in the corridors to ask what he had observed. 2 Velthari intelligence staff had requested informal conversations about his methodology. Gene had been patient with all of it and had explained as clearly as he could that the methodology was not a system. It was the accumulated habit of paying attention to people for 22 years in a job where the difference between a right reading and a wrong one had consequences. He had also quietly and without fanfare begun running an informal observation training session twice a week for any station personnel who wanted to attend. The sessions had no official designation. They met in a corner of the common area during off hours, and Gene sat in a chair and talked about what he had learned about reading human beings under pressure, and the small group who came to listen had grown each week. By the 4th session, there were soldiers from 6 different species sitting in the available chairs and on the floor, learning how to watch a room the way retired homicide detective watched room. One evening after a session, Grath sat down next to Gene and said, "You could have been a soldier." Gene shook his head. "I was," he said, "just in a different kind of war." Grath thought about that for a long time afterward. The assessment from Concordat High Command, delivered 8 weeks after the human volunteers' arrival, described the integration as operationally transformative and recommended permanent incorporation of the human auxiliary unit into the Concordat standing combat support structure. The vote in the Assembly was 91-7 in favor. The 7 dissenting votes were all from species whose representatives had not yet visited Farrat Station or spoken directly with anyone who had. Myra Sultan, reading the result from her office, allowed herself a small Private moment of satisfaction. Then she opened the next report in her queue. Because there was a great deal of work still to do, and she had learned from watching the people Keisha represented that the right response to a problem solved was to find the next one outside. In the corridor 2 floors down, Lou Garrett was returning from a supply run. He had a clipboard in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. He passed Grath in the hallway. Grath nodded. Lou nodded back. They kept walking in their separate directions, both of them already thinking about the next thing. The briefing room on Farratt Station's command level could hold 40 people if they were willing to sit close. On the morning Carol Vance presented the Valerith operational plan, there were 61 people in it. Some were standing along the walls. The Keth officers near the back had adjusted their posture to make space for a pair of Lurin coordinators who had arrived late. Nobody had left. Nobody had suggested moving to a larger room. The plan Carol had been constructed over 3 weeks of analysis that most of them already knew was the most thorough strategic work the station had produced in 2 years, and the word had spread before the briefing even began. The central display showed the Valerith system, a colony world, one of the first human settlements in the outer sectors, had been under Dominion blockade for 4 months. The colonists were not under direct attack. They were simply being starved of supplies, slowly and deliberately, in the way that a patient enemy applies pressure when it believes time is on its side. Concordat had attempted 2 relief runs. Both had been turned back by the Dominion blockade fleet without a direct engagement because the Dominion's positioning gave them the firing angle, and the blockade had been set up with a specific geometry that made a direct assault unacceptably costly. Carol had found the gap. It had taken her 3 weeks of reading the blockade data, the sensor logs, the scheduling records from the Dominion supply runs, and the technical specifications of the sensor network the Dominion was using to maintain the blockade. The gap was this: the Dominion blockade used a rotating sensor net that overlapped in a specific pattern to ensure continuous coverage. That pattern had a flaw every 72 hours when the 2 primary sensor arrays completed their rotation cycle simultaneously. There was an 11-minute window in which the overlap was insufficient. During that window, a convoy approaching from a specific vector, a vector that was oblique to the standard relief approach and required travel arc, would be below the sensor threshold. The flaw had been created by a software update to one of the arrays 6 weeks earlier. The update had been intended to improve energy efficiency. It had introduced a timing offset that nobody in the Dominion's technical review had caught because the 2 arrays were managed by separate administrative units, and the combined effect of the timing change had not been evaluated at the system level. Carol had found it because she had evaluated it at the system level, because she had learned over 30 years of managing complex supply chains that the failure point was almost always in the space between systems, not inside any one of them. When she finished presenting the plan, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Commander Vrak, who was standing against the left wall with his arms crossed, said, "How did you find this?" Carol said, "I read the data until it told me something." Vrak nodded slowly. "How long will the window hold?" "Until they run another software review or someone notices they Offset, Carol said. Could be days. Could be longer, we move soon. Vrac looked at the display, he looked at the approach vector, he looked at the timing, he said this will work. That was the whole of his endorsement. For Vrac, it was equivalent to a standing ovation. The operation was designated Relief Corridor 7. The force assembled for it included 4 Concordat transport ships, 2 Keth escort frigates, and a medical vessel that Walt Prout was already aboard because Walt had been living on the medical vessel for 3 days before the operation launched, setting up the trauma protocol that his team was going to use and running his mixed-species medic crew through every scenario he could construct. The mixed crew was the thing that had surprised people. Walt's trauma team for the operation included 8 Lurin medics, 3 Keth field surgeons, 2 human nurses from the 2nd Volunteer Wave, and 1 Velthari specialist named Taryn, who had requested the assignment specifically because she had attended 3 of Walt's training sessions on Feroth and had decided with the methodical determination her species was known for that she wanted to know everything Walt knew. They ran 6 drills in 3 days. By the 3rd drill, they were moving like a unit. By the 6th, Walt had stopped calling out instructions because the team had internalized the sequence. During the last drill, Tessic, who had come aboard as a consultant because the operation was significant enough to warrant it, watched from the back of the bay without saying anything until it was over. Then he said, "This is the best trauma team I have seen assembled in 14 years of field medicine." Walt said they learned fast. Tusk said they had a good teacher. Walt was quiet for a moment. "I have had good teachers too," he said. "They just don't know they taught me anything." The ground component of the operation required someone to move through the colonists' shelter network beneath Valarath's surface and guide the civilian population to the extraction corridors. The shelter network had been constructed when the colony was established 20 years earlier as a standard emergency infrastructure. It was old now, imperfectly maintained, and sections of it had been compromised by the seismic activity that Valarath's geological survey rated as moderate and ongoing. Some tunnels were flooded, some had partial collapses. The route through the network to the extraction corridors required navigating approximately 3 km of underground passages in conditions that were, depending on the section, between moderately difficult and genuinely dangerous. The planning team had spent a day and a half trying to figure out who to assign to the tunnel navigation team. They needed someone with specific experience in underground movement, structural assessment of compromised spaces, and the comm to manage a large group of frightened civilians in a confined environment. They needed someone who would not freeze when a passage turned out to be worse than expected, and who had the practical knowledge to find an alternative route when the primary one was no longer viable. The planning team had gone through 17 names before someone said Lou Garrett. Lou was told about the assignment by Carol, who sat down across from him in the supply section and explained it plainly. She told him what the network looked like, what the conditions were likely to be, and what the mission required. She asked if he was willing. Lou listened to all of it, asked 2 questions about the geological survey data and 1 question about the communication equipment they could bring underground, and then said yes. Graf had already volunteered before anyone asked him. He had gone to Carol's office the morning after the tunnel assignment was discussed and said he wanted to be on Lou's team. Carol had looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone evaluating a piece of information that already confirmed something they suspected. She said yes, the team that went into the tunnels was Lou Graff 2, Keth soldiers from Prall's fire team, and Ruth Garza, the retired school principal from New Mexico who had been assigned to the operations civilian coordination role because her application note had been right. Managing large groups of frightened people in confined and difficult circumstances was in fact a transferable skill. They entered the tunnel network at 3:40 station time, 3 hours before the 11-minute window in the sensor net was scheduled to open. The first kilometer was passable, the second was not. Section that the survey data had marked as structurally sound had been further compromised by a seismic event in the previous 2 weeks, and the passage was partially blocked by a fall of stone and structural material from the ceiling. Lou examined it for 4 minutes with a handheld light and the focused attention of a man who had spent his career reading what rock was about to do. Then he said it could be cleared and explained exactly how to do it without triggering a secondary fall. Graph end. The 2 Keth soldiers cleared it in 31 minutes. Lou directed every move of it from a position where he could see the stress points in the remaining ceiling structure. The colonists were in the shelter chambers 300 m past the collapse point. There were 341 of them. Most were elderly. A significant number were children. They had been in the shelters for 4 months, living on stored provisions that were down to their last 3 weeks. They were frightened, tired, and carrying the particular strain of people who have been patient for a long time, past the point where patience feels sustainable. Ruth Garza walked into the main shelter chamber ahead of Lou and stood in the center of the room, and in a clear, calm voice that carried to every corner of the space, she said, "My name is Ruth. We are here to take you home. I need you to listen carefully and move when I tell you, and everyone is going to be fine." The room quieted, not all at once, but it quieted. Lou later said that watching Ruth work in that shelter chamber was one of the most impressive things he had seen in his life, and that he had seen some things. She moved through the crowd with the specific competence of someone who had spent 30 years managing the organized movement of people who were not necessarily inclined to organize themselves. She sorted families, identified the individuals who would need physical assistance, positioned the Keth soldiers where they could provide support without crowding the civilians, and got 341 people moving through a series of damaged underground passages in an ordered flow that maintained pace, prevented panic, and accounted for every person at every checkpoint. It took 2 hours and 17 minutes to get everyone through the network to the extraction corridor. At one point in the deepest section of the 3rd kilometer, where the tunnel ceiling dropped and the flooding came to knee height, a child of perhaps 5 or 6 years stopped moving and began to cry with the exhausted, complete crying of a very small person who has been frightened for too long. Ruth was 3 positions back in the line. Lou was nearest to the child. He crouched down in the knee-deep water, put himself at eye level, and said, "Hey, you know what I used to do when things got scary in the dark?" The child shook her head. I counted my steps. Lou said, every step is one more step. Toward the light, you want to count with. Me, the child thought about this, then. She nodded. Lou took her hand with his good arm and they started counting. They counted to 112 before the tunnel ceiling rose and the water receded, and the light of the extraction corridor appeared ahead. The child let go of his hand when she saw her mother at the end of the passage. She did not look back. Lou watched her go, stood up slowly, and kept walking. Above them, the 11-minute window in the Dominion sensor net opened. At exactly the time Carol had predicted, the convoy moved through on the prescribed vector. The Dominion sensor arrays showed nothing. The blockade fleet saw nothing. The 4 Concordat support ships and 2 escort frigates passed through the sensor gap without a single alarm being raised, and by the time the window closed, the convoy was already inside the threshold that made engagement geometrically unfavorable for the Dominion fleet. In the command center of the lead Concordat ship, the officer watching the sensor board counted the seconds of the window in her head and said nothing until it closed. Then she released a breath she had been holding for 11 minutes and said, quietly, clear. The evacuation of the colonists was completed in 4 hours and 20 minutes. The extraction corridors connected to shuttle bays that had been prepositioned outside the Dominion's coverage zone, and the shuttles moved the colonists to the support ships in 3 waves. When the last shuttle docked and the count came back complete, 341 colonists, 341 accounted for. The ship's commander stood at the count board for a moment and then turned to his crew and said, all hands, the colony is clear. The complication came during the 3rd wave. Gene Ackefer was not on the ground team. He had been assigned to the communications room of the lead Concordat ship, a role that Carol had given him because she had a specific sense of where his skills were most needed, and it was not in a tunnel. She had put him where people talked because Gene's most valuable function was listening. The Dominion attempted a communications deception during the 3rd wave. It was a sophisticated operation, a false distress signal in the standard Concordat emergency frequency, formatted to replicate the signature of a damaged support ship with coordinates that would redirect the convoy toward a prepared engagement zone where the Dominion fleet had positioned itself to take the decisive shot. The signal was well constructed. It passed the automated verification systems without triggering a flag. The communications officers on 3 of the 4 Concordat ships were already processing the redirect when Gene said, stop. He had been sitting in the corner of the communications room, listening to the ambient chatter of the operation when the false signal came in. He had not been monitoring that specific frequency. He had been watching the room. As he always watched rooms, what he had noticed was the communications officer's body language when she began processing the signal. She moved differently than she had been moving for the previous 4 hours. She moved with a small, subtle urgency of someone who has received important information and is acting on it without fully thinking it through. First, it was a very small thing. It was the kind of thing that did not appear in any protocol and would not trigger any system. Gene stood up and walked to her station and looked at the signal. He read it twice. Then he said, this is wrong. The officer said the verification systems had cleared it. Jean said the distress formatting is standard. The content is not. A ship that has taken battle damage does not include its full navigational complement. In the emergency broadcast, there is no reason to send navigational data in a distress call unless you want someone to come to a specific place. The officer looked at the signal again, then she looked at Jean, then she put it on hold and flagged it for the ship's commander. The commander reviewed it with a tactical officer. They ran a secondary analysis. Jean's reading was correct. The coordinates in the signal placed the convoy directly in the center of the Dominion's engagement zone. The convoy was redirected away from it, and when the Dominion fleet fired on the expected position, the space was empty. The Dominion fleet disengaged 20 minutes later. There was nothing left to engage. In the after-action report, Jean's identification of the false signal received 3 paragraphs of formal commendation. When asked by the ship's commander how he had spotted it, Jean gave his answer in the same words he had used before on Ferret Station the day he had identified the operative. The message was too clean. Real distress is never that clean. I have taken enough emergency calls to know the difference. The relief of Vel Areth was complete. The Concordat's operational analysis of Relief Corridor 7 was circulated to all command levels the following week. The summary was 14 pages. The relevant section on the factors contributing to the operation's success identified 2 primary elements. The first was the sensor gap analysis that had created the operational window. The second was described in 3 sentences: the stability of the mixed units throughout the operation was a decisive factor, preventing cascade failures at multiple critical junctures. This stability was anchored in the assessment of the reviewing officers by experienced human personnel who appear to have established a standard of measured competence that spread laterally through Allied units. The mechanism by which this transfer occurred is not fully captured by current operational frameworks and is recommended for further study. In the Concordat Assembly, the session that reviewed the Vel Areth operation was the first one in the 12 weeks since the initial volunteer submission that did not include any laughter. Delegate Sora spoke twice, both times to move motions that benefited the human auxiliary unit's permanent integration. She was efficient about it. She did not make speeches. She moved her motions. They were voted on and they passed. The Keth military section submitted a formal request to expand joint training programs with human auxiliary units across all Concordat military facilities. The request was approved. The Loren Medical Division submitted a request for Walt's Unified Triage protocol to be adopted as the Concordat standard. Test Seek had written the supporting documentation himself in 6 languages and had noted in the cover memo that the protocol had produced the best trauma outcomes in the Concordat's operational history. The request was approved. The Training Division submitted a request to distribute Donna Hale's Field Adaptation Manual to all Concordat junior officers. This request was also approved and Donna was notified. She was at the time in the middle of writing the 3rd edition. The Dominion's Intelligence Division updated their assessment of the human volunteer force. The new conclusion was 2 sentences. The first read: the tactical risk posed by this population group was underestimated in all prior assessments. The second read: we recommend this Error not be repeated, in a small room. On Forest Station, 3 weeks after. Valerith, Lou Garrett sat at a table with a letter in front of him. It had come through the interstation communication system that morning. It was from his grandson Danny, who served as a gunner on a Concordat frigate that had been part of the escort element for relief. Corridor 7, Danny had not known his grandfather was part of the operation until after it was over. He had found out the way soldiers found the things out, which was through a chain of conversations that eventually led to the right person who had been in the right place. The letter was short because Danny was not a man who used more words than necessary, which Lou had always considered a quality worth having. It said, "Granddad, I heard. I am glad you are here. I am going to need you to be careful because I do not know what I would do without you to go home to, but I also know you, so I will just say thank you for being here, for being you, for doing what you do." Lou read it twice, then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. Outside in the corridor he could hear the normal sounds of the station at work. Someone's boots on the metal floor, a technical announcement. 3 languages, the distant low tone of the ventilation system, the ordinary, unglamorous sound of a place where people were doing the difficult work of keeping things running. Lou put his hand on the table, the prosthetic hand, the one that had, in the course of the previous weeks, helped fix a comm unit, draw a sketch that improved a supply chain, and count steps with a frightened child in a flooded tunnel. He sat for one more moment, then he stood up, picked up his clipboard, and went back to work. Walt Prout stayed at Farad Station for 6 more months after Valera. The official reason was consultation, work on the trauma protocol rollout. The real reason, which he did not articulate to anyone but which Tessic understood without being told, was that there were still people who needed what he knew. And the calculation was the same one he had always made. The math was simple. During those 6 months, he trained 417 medics from 11 species in the unified triage protocol. He ran the training the same way he ran the emergency rooms he had worked in back home, with patience, with precision, and with the steady insistence that every detail mattered, because the details were what kept people alive. Taran the Velthari specialist who had attended his training session became his most skilled student. On Walt's last day at the station, she came to find him in the medical bay and said, "What you have given us will keep working after you are gone." Walt said, "That's the point." He went home. He was not celebrated when he arrived. He had not asked for celebration. He went back to his house, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, the early morning light, and looked out the window at the ordinary world. Outside he was fine. Carol Vance remained at Concordat High Command for 3 years. In that time, the supply efficiency improvements she introduced to the Concordat's logistics network produced a measurable reduction in operational costs that was cited in the annual strategic review as one of the most significant infrastructure contributions in the organization's recent history. When she eventually stepped back from the role, the transition plan she had written for her successor was the most detailed document the Strategic Planning Division had ever received. They used it as the template for all future transitions. Donna Hale kept updating the manual. The 4th Edition added a section on zero gravity, terrain navigations that she had developed in consultation with 3 Keth engineers and a Lurin physicist. The 5th edition incorporated feedback from junior officers across 16 different species who had used the manual in the field and had sent her their notes. She read every note. She incorporated the ones that were right. She replied to all of them. Gene Ackerfer went home to Michigan. He bought the fishing cabin he had been thinking about. He fished. He kept mostly to himself, in the way of someone who has spent enough years being around people and has earned the right to a stretch of quiet. He sent short messages occasionally, 1 to Carol, 1 to Myra Sultan, 1 unexpectedly to Grath, who by that point was stationed at a joint training facility and who replied with a message that was 3 times as long as the one Gene had sent, which Gene read with something close to amusement and filed away without comment. Grath was the first Keth officer to formally request permanent joint assignment embedded with a human unit. The request, when it moved through the Concordat's administrative channels, generated a small amount of bureaucratic friction because there was no existing category for it. Grath had known this when he submitted it. He had written a 1-page justification, which was twice the length of most formal requests, that made the case for why the category should be created. The category was created. Grath's request was approved. He was also by that point teaching a course to Keth Jr. officers on working with Allied units. One of the required readings in the course was Donna Hale's field manual. Another was a 3-page document that Grath had written himself titled What I Learned on Ferret Station, which described in plain language what he had observed about the human volunteer force during the weeks of working alongside them. The document did not use any terminology from the Concordat's official frameworks. It used the language of someone who had watched something and wanted to describe it accurately. The document ended with 1 sentence. It read, "They came when they were called, they did what was needed, and they asked for nothing in return. I have decided that this is the best definition of strength I have ever encountered, and I intend to try to live by it." The sentence was quoted in 2 subsequent Concordat policy documents and eventually appeared, translated in a Velthari diplomatic publication on interspecies cooperation. It was attributed to a Keth officer and a human minor, which was not quite accurate, but was not quite wrong either. Myra Sultan. Read the quote. When the publication arrived in her office, she had been promoted 3 times in the 3 years since she had stood at the center days of the Concordat Assembly and said 7 words. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job, but she had become something more than that in the time since, because she had spent those years watching 47 million people demonstrate in the particular and practical ways of people who have nothing left to prove exactly what it looked like when strength had nothing to do with being new. She had learned from them. She thought she would probably spend the rest of her career trying to explain what she had learned to one assembly or another in one language or another. She did not mind. She had been given good material to work with. She put the publication on her desk, opened to the page with Grath's sentence, and went back to the next report in her queue. Outside the window of her office, the lights of Vorath Prime Station ring moved in their slow and ordered circuit, and somewhere beyond them, in the distances that were not distances anymore, the galaxy went about its work. It was a large and old and complicated place full of species who had learned a great deal and were still in the process of learning more. The lesson that had just been added to the curriculum was simple. Do not laugh before you know what you are looking at, and never under any circumstances decide that someone is finished before they have told you so themselves.